Hey guys, this is Jeremy, and this is going to be my Fear Street Saga review. This trilogy came out in 1993. Each book was 1 month apart from each other, first in August, September, and then the last one in October. These books focused on the background of the Fear family curse, all the strange events that occur around Fear Street and in Shadyside, and how Fear Street actually became to be Fear Street. There's not too much for me to say in this introduction, so we'll just go ahead and get right to the reviews. The first book is The Betrayal. The story begins in 1900. The townspeople of Shadyside Village are gathered around the old Fear family mansion. Nora Good and the people of the village watch as the mansion burns in a violent, raging fire. The people gossip as they watch, claiming that the fire will burn the mansion forever because of the curse that follows the Fear family. Nora, however, watches in horror as she waits for her lover, Daniel Fear, to emerge from the flaming mansion. She runs up to a window and peers inside. She sees visions of people dancing inside as they burn up in the flames, but one particular apparition stands out, a young girl screaming in agony as the flames grow hotter. What kind of tragedy happened years ago? What kind of evil curse has followed the Fear family all these years? What had they done to deserve this cruel fate? To understand the root of all the evil surrounding the Fear family, you must travel back 200 years ago to an old Massachusetts colonial village named Wickham. The year is 1692, and the village has already witnessed 3 women be tried and burned at the stake for being witches. The trials were conducted by the village magistrate, Benjamin Fear, along with the help of his assistant and brother, Matthew Fear. Now the last name Fear is spelled F-I-E-R, not F-E-A-R like you're used to seeing it. There's a reason for the different spelling, and we will get to that later. The 2 brothers are one of the most fortunate families in all of the village. They have money, their farms bring in all the best crops, and they are very high up in their social status among the villagers. Benjamin also has a son named Edward Fear, who is also highly respected in the village. Benjamin has set up an arranged marriage for his son. He is expected to marry a young woman named August Ward, the daughter of another wealthy family from a neighboring village. But Edward has other plans, for he is secretly in love with a young girl named Susanna Good. Susanna is from a less wealthy family, who lives with her father and mother, Martha and William Good, and her younger brother George, who is just an infant. Neither Susanna or Edward's parents are aware of their affair. The young lovers would often meet at their secret place in the woods. The townspeople tell stories about the forest. They talk about the witches that gather in the woods, and the rituals and dances they perform for the evil one. Eventually, the villagers begin to notice Susanna and Edward walking out into the woods, and rumors about the young couple begin to spread around Wickham. During one of their meetings, the couple decides that it's time to tell their families about their love for each other. That night, over dinner, Susanna tries to talk to her father about Edward, but her father confronts her about the rumors going around town. She admits to being in love with Edward, but William has terrible news for her. He tells her that Edward is to be engaged to another woman, at which point Susanna becomes highly upset, for Edward had never mentioned anything about another woman or even an arranged marriage. Susanna believes that Edward has lied and taken advantage of her. On that same night, Edward goes to his father about Susanna. Benjamin becomes furious when he hears this. He had set up the arranged marriage to further the wealth of the Fear family. Edward debates whether or not to disobey his father's orders, but he quickly decides to stand his ground and oppose his father. He refuses to marry a woman that he isn't even in love with. Benjamin tells him he has no choice. As the argument becomes more heated, neither of them can come to an agreement, and Edward ends up storming out of the house. Benjamin has worked too hard to get to where he is now, and he's not about to let a poor commoner girl stand in the way of his plans. The next evening, Martha and Susanna are preparing dinner for William before he comes home, when they suddenly hear a knock at the door. Martha opens the door to find Benjamin Fear and 2 guards. Benjamin asks if William is at home. She tells him no and that her husband is at the village commons. But before she has a chance to react, the men push their way into the small house. Benjamin tells the 2 guards to search the home for the proof he needs. Martha demands to know what proof they are looking for. Benjamin claims to be looking for proof of witchcraft. Martha and Susanna claim to take no part in the dark arts. Benjamin steps up to their hearth and picks up a small purple bag from behind the kettle. The bag contained a chicken's foot, some feathers, dried roots, some kind of small bone, and a glass vial containing a blood-colored liquid. Martha and Susanna deny any knowledge of the bag or its contents. Benjamin tells the guards to take them away, for they will be tried as witches. As they are taken from their home, Martha hands George over to the neighbor and asks them to take care of him while she is away. That evening, William shows up at the courthouse to see his wife and daughter sitting in the prisoner's box. He tries to deny the accusations of witchcraft. Benjamin tells him to keep quiet in his courtroom. Benjamin asks them to confess their crimes, but they still deny. William continues to make a scene demanding that the charges are false. Benjamin has had enough of William and finally has him thrown out of the courtroom. Martha and Susanna are given one last chance to fess up to their crime of witchcraft. They refuse one final time. Benjamin then declares that their persistent denial only furthers the belief that they are truly guilty. He sentences them to burn at the stake tomorrow at sundown. Later that night, a distraught William paces his house, overcome by the tragedy that is about to befall his family, when suddenly he is stirred from his thoughts by a knock at his door. It's Matthew Fear, and he has come to William's house with an offer. He tells William that he can persuade his brother to change his judgment on his family. He tells him that for £100 his family can be spared. William tells him that he only has £80. Matthew says he will take all of his money and any valuable items from the house until the debt is fully paid. William agrees to the offer. He will do whatever it takes to save his family. Matthew tells him his wife and daughter will be released at sundown tomorrow. The next evening, William joyfully runs to the commons to see his family be released. But to his surprise, the haystacks are prepped and ready, and so are the townspeople, waiting to see the witches burn for their crimes. Then he sees his wife and daughter being led to the stakes. William cries out to the guards to release them, but they refuse to listen and hold him back. He tells them that Matthew was supposed to speak with his brother about releasing them. But when William demands to speak with the Fear brothers, the guards tell him the shocking truth. The Fear brothers had fled the town the night before and have not been seen since. What will happen to Martha and Susanna? Will William convince them to release his family, or will Edward come to rescue his true love? The next story is The Secret. This book begins with Nora as she continues to tell her story. She is quickly running out of time. The next part of her story takes place in 1737. 12-year-old Jonathan Fear, the great-grandson of Benjamin Fear, along with the rest of his family, have just arrived in Wickham. They were led there by his father, Ezra Fear. Jonathan's father carries a strange three-clawed pendant around his neck and seems to always be searching for something or someone, causing the family to always be moving around. As they explore the town of Wickham, they find the town abandoned and littered with dead bodies everywhere. It seems they were wiped out by some sort of plague. Ezra tells his family they have one last place to go. He takes them to a small farmhouse at the edge of town. It's the old Good family house. Ezra tells the family about the Goods, how he believes they are responsible for the curse that follows their family. Jonathan and the rest of the family don't believe the curse is real. Ezra decides to settle down and live in the old Good house for a while. They find plenty of supplies for food and clothing. Ezra believes that he might find clues to where the Goods have gone. As time goes by, the family makes themselves at home in the new house. One day, Ezra takes Jonathan to a nearby farmhouse looking for any surviving people in the town. They find a man living in a nearby farm. Ezra introduces himself and Jonathan. Ezra tells the man that he has come to inquire about the Good family. The man reacts strangely when he asks about the Goods. He begins to walk towards his shed. Ezra and Jonathan follow him. Suddenly, the man comes lunging out of the shed at Ezra, grabs him, and holds a knife to his throat. He tells Ezra that the witchcraft of the Good family had cursed the town and brought a plague upon them. Ezra tells the man that he is only seeking the Goods to get revenge for the curse they brought to his family. The man releases Ezra, but warns him to never come around again. Jonathan and his father leave the home, but Jonathan can't help but wonder if his father is right about the family curse. Eventually, Abigail, who is 8 years old and the oldest of Jonathan's 2 younger sisters, tells her mother Jane Fear that she is bored and wants to explore around outside. Jane tells Jonathan to take his sister out and watch over her. Abigail tells Jonathan that she wants to check out the abandoned village. Jonathan tells her no, he doesn't want to surround her with all the dead bodies that littered the town. But Abigail won't listen and heads to town anyways, with Jonathan reluctantly following. They search some of the houses and old buildings. Abigail doesn't seem to be bothered by the ghost town at all and playfully explores each new place. Eventually they come across the skeletal remains of a little puppy. Abigail wants to give the remains a proper burial. Jonathan searches a nearby house and returns with a shovel to bury the puppy. For the next couple days, Jonathan and Abigail continue to return to the village and bury more animal remains, until one day they find the remains of a little girl. Abigail wants to give her a burial too. Jonathan leaves to find a box big enough to put the little girl in. When he returns, he finds Abigail playing with another little girl. She seemed to be the same age as Abigail, but as Jonathan tries to approach them, the little girl runs away. Abigail tells him that her name was Hester, and she lives in Wickham. Feeling a little freaked out by the situation, Jonathan quickly leads Abigail back home before nightfall. The next day, they return to bury a dead infant they found. Again, Jonathan goes to find a box to put the baby in. When he returns, he finds Abigail playing with Hester again, but this time he stayed back and watched in secret. He followed them to an old graveyard. Jonathan watched as Hester led Abigail to an open grave. Hester jumps into the coffin, then reaches up and pulls Abigail into the coffin with her. Jonathan rushes over to the grave and pulls open the coffin. He finds Abigail calmly laying down in the coffin, and Hester had completely vanished. Jonathan is now officially scared and doesn't want to return to the village anymore. The following day, Hester shows up at Jonathan's house and asks Ezra if Abigail can come out and play. Having a soft spot for his daughter, Ezra finds it hard to tell Abigail no and allows her to go play with Hester. Jonathan offers to go with them. He doesn't trust Hester and fears what might happen to Abigail, but Ezra tells him that he is too old to be playing with little girls. That night, Abigail doesn't return home. Ezra tries to remain calm as night begins to fall, but Jonathan fears the worst may have happened to Abigail. Eventually, Ezra decides he needs to go to the village and look for Abigail. He tells Jonathan to stay behind, but Jonathan doesn't listen to his father and sneaks out after him. Ezra makes his way into the village, following the sounds of little girls' laughter. He begins to feel uneasy as he walks through the empty streets of the abandoned town. He follows the laughter to a graveyard. He begins to look at the headstones as he passes by the graves. He stops when he finds a headstone bearing the name Hester Good. Then his heart drops as he reads the next headstone beside Hester's, Abigail Fear. He cries out as he frantically begins to dig up the ground in front of Abigail's headstone. Jonathan, no longer worried about hiding from his father's view, jumps out and begins helping his father dig up Abigail's grave. They stop when they reach a small coffin. They pull open the lid and stare in horror at the lifeless body of Abigail Fear. Now, 6 years have passed by as the family moves on and tries to continue life without little Abigail. It's 1743, and the Fear family has now moved again to western Massachusetts. Jonathan is nearly 18, and his youngest sister Rachel is now 8, the same age as Abigail before the night she died. Ezra tells Rachel the story of the family curse as a bedtime story now. He continues to obsess over the curse, and claims that it was the curse that took Abigail's life. And as for Jonathan's mother Jane, she had a very hard time dealing with Abigail's death, at times showing signs of strange behavior, like talking and acting as if Abigail was still at home with the family. Sometimes she even mistook Rachel for Abigail. Shortly after settling into their new home, the Fears are welcomed by a young teenage girl named Delilah Wilson. She lives in a nearby farm with her father, Reverend Wilson. While Delilah is meeting with the family, Rachel comes running out of her room, excited to meet their new neighbor. Jonathan is reluctant to give away too much information on the family's background and the reason behind their recent move, but Rachel quickly blurts out the story of the family curse and tells Delilah about the death of her older sister Abigail. A few days later, Jonathan runs into Delilah at the town market. He apologizes to her for the story Rachel told her. Delilah tells him not to worry and encourages him to not worry about the curse his father is so worried about. As the days go by, strange things begin happening around the Fear house. Jonathan hears strange animal cries at night, finds their well bucket full of blood, and some nights he finds his mother roaming the house calling out to Abigail and claiming to hear Abigail's voice calling out to her. Jonathan grows more concerned with each strange event, and only finding comfort while confiding in Delilah. He realizes that he is beginning to have feelings for Delilah, but the more he opens up to her, the more worried she becomes, even to the point that she begins acting strange around him. Jonathan struggles to make sense of everything that's been happening, and it all gets even worse on the night Jonathan hears Abigail's voice for himself. He hears Abigail's dreadful warning as she calls to him, and just before dawn the next morning, Jonathan and his family are awakened by a blood-curdling scream. When they all come together, they realize that Jane is missing. What will happen to the Fear family? What has happened to Jane? And why is Delilah starting to act so strange? And will Jonathan ever find out the truth behind the family's curse? The third and final book of the series is The Burning. Nora begins to tell the final part of her story, the story of Simon Fear, the worst story of all. Simon believed that if he changed his last name to Fear, F-E-A-R, it would help relieve him of the family curse. Maybe people wouldn't recognize the name so easily. Simon wants to bring wealth and prosperity to the Fear family. The year is 1845. He has moved to New Orleans. He has his sights set on the Pierce family, more particularly Angelica Pierce, the daughter of Henry Pierce. He believes that if he could win the heart of Angelica, he could bring back wealth to the Fear family. Simon decides to sneak into one of Henry's house parties to try and meet Angelica. He manages to make it into the party, but he discovers that Angelica already has 2 suitors competing for her hand in marriage. James Dumere, or Dumay, I'm not sure how to pronounce it because I found both pronunciations online, and Scott Hamilton. Angelica notices Simon at the party and asks her cousin Liza who the strange young man is. Neither of them have ever seen him around town before. Angelica notices that Simon is staring at her from across the room. She begins to feel uncomfortable, but shortly after, the servants working as security finally catch up to Simon and throw him out of the party. After the party, Angelica walks around in the garden. Simon sneaks over the garden wall to meet up with Angelica alone. Angelica is startled and surprised by his boldness and calls him out for sneaking into her father's party as well. He tells her that it was all done for her. He confesses his love for her and vows that they will one day be married. She tells him that she would never marry someone like him and warns him to leave before she has him thrown out again. He does as she wishes, but promises that he will return. After leaving the Pierce garden, Simon is stopped by a man in the alleyway. The man puts a knife to Simon's throat and demands that he hands over his money. Simon fears for his life and agrees to hand over what he has. The man loosens his grip on Simon. As he digs into his pockets, his pendant becomes visible around his neck, the same pendant that had been passed down by the generations of the Fear family. The man tells Simon he wants the pendant as well. Simon clutches the pendant in his hand. He tells the man he will give him anything he wants, anything but the pendant. The man still demands the pendant. Left with no choice, Simon panics, grabs his pendant, and stabs the man in the face with it. The man becomes outraged and charges toward Simon with his knife in hand, but the man stops short and begins to scream in agony. Simon watches as the man's flesh begins to rot and fall off of his face. Simon now stands alone in the alley, looking down at the corpse of the man who just tried to rob him. Simon never really believed that the pendant held any power, and he never tried to invoke its power either. But now he knew the power was real. He realized that now was the perfect time to embrace the power of the pendant and use it to make Angelica his wife. But first, he has to remove two obstacles, James and Scott. Over the next couple months, both men die from strange freak accidents. Each time one passes, Simon is always there to comfort Angelica, and with time, they grow closer and closer, until the night comes when he finally proposes to her. Now, 20 years later, Simon and Angelica are happily married with 5 children. Their 2 daughters, Julia and Hannah, and their 3 sons, Robert, Brandon, and Joseph. The year is 1865. The Fear family has grown to become very rich and prosperous. They live in a town called Shadyside. Simon plans to build a library in the town of Shadyside and has planned a dinner party which he intends to invite a lot of town officials, including the mayor, to discuss his plans for the library. As the servants prepare for the dinner, Miss Mackenzie, the head servant, is walking the new servant girl through the house. After showing the new girl all her chores, Miss Mackenzie tells the girl that she must sign her name off on the chore list. She asks the girl for her name. The girl tells her that her name is Lucy Good. Miss Mackenzie is startled by the name. She warns Lucy to be careful around here and to not let word get out that she is a Good. She tells her that Simon has often told stories about how the Fears were betrayed by the Goods years ago. That night at the dinner party, as the servants are serving the guests, Lucy mistakenly pours hot soup on Julia. Julia believes it was done intentionally. As the days go by, more and more strange things begin to happen around the Fear home. One day, all of the Fear children, along with their family dog, go out for a picnic into the woods. Before the family eats their food, Hannah breaks off a small piece of her pie and feeds it to the dog. A few moments later, the dog begins to act strangely, and eventually falling over dead in front of the 2 sisters. They discover that the pies that were prepared for the picnic were poisoned. Hannah believes the pies were prepared by none other than Lucy Good. She races back home to confront Lucy and alert her father of what's been going on. But Hannah is not prepared for what happens when she returns home. She is not prepared for the horrible truth that awaits her. So that'll be it for my review of the Fear Street Saga. All 3 books are tied together into one continuous story, but in order for me to give a good review without giving away any spoilers, I really had to talk around certain things in the story and leave out a lot of crucial events from the reviews. Plus, I had to watch what I said going from one book to the next. If I tell you about something in one book, and then in the next book mention something else, you can put 2 and 2 together and figure out what happened in the last book. But I felt like I did a pretty good job. Yeah, I did give away a few small spoilers in the reviews, but at the same time, there was a ton of stuff that I didn't even mention. That way, for those who haven't read the trilogy, they can know what the stories are about and still be able to read the books and enjoy the stories and still be surprised at certain things that are happening in the story. For me, this was my second time reading through this trilogy. I remember the first time I read the books, I enjoyed the stories, but I remember feeling like the stories got repetitive about halfway through the second book. After reading through these books again for the second time, I felt like I enjoyed it more this time, and for some reason I didn't really feel the repetition that I felt the first time I read the books. The first book contained some of the more darker death scenes compared to the other 2 books, which I really enjoyed. I've got to really appreciate those few times where R.L. Stine actually gets pretty dark in his death scenes. One downside that I will admit to is that some of the events in the book seemed a little rushed. Although the main underlining part of the story is about Nora Good in the 1900s telling her stories of the past families, the bulk of each book is focused on each of the past stories. So this trilogy felt like a collection of short stories. But other than that, I did enjoy these books. The reason I wanted to reread these books was because I recently completed my Fear Street Sagas collection. I've been eager to read the series, so I wanted to read these books again before starting the Saga series. If you are interested in reading these books, there's always the original 3 books, which you can find in used bookstores or order them online. Then there's also a collector's edition compilation of the 3 books. This was released in 1996, 3 years after the original books came out. This copy may be a little harder to get a hold of and probably a little more pricier than the 3 books by themselves. But this book does come with a cool little fold-out poster that shows a detailed picture of the Fear family tree. Now, the easiest way to read these books would be to pick up this newer compilation called Betrayal. This was released in 2015. It contains all 3 books, and you can probably still find this in newer bookstores like Barnes & Noble or Books A Million. But this will be it for my review. Hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for everyone that comments and subscribes, and I will see you guys next time.